At 9:37 in the morning on April 12, 1945, Oscar Chapman stood in the hallway outside the cabinet room of the White House, watching as Vice President Harry S. Truman hurried past him toward the president's office. Truman had been summoned urgently. He didn't know why. Chapman was Assistant Secretary of the Interior, a career civil servant who'd worked with Roosevelt's team for 12 years. Roosevelt had been in Georgia for weeks, resting at his retreat in Warm Springs. Now suddenly Truman was being called to the White House with no explanation. At 5:47 that afternoon, Chapman learned what everyone in Washington was about to discover. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was dead. Harry Truman was president. And everything was about to change. Truman asked all of Roosevelt's cabinet to stay. He told them he needed them. The war in Europe was ending. The war in the Pacific continued. America needed stability. The cabinet agreed. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. had served Roosevelt for 11 years. Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes had been there for 13. Secretary of Commerce Henry Wallace had been Roosevelt's vice president. These men knew how Roosevelt thought. They knew his vision for America and the post-war world. But there was a problem these men didn't see coming. Harry Truman wasn't Franklin Roosevelt. He'd been vice president for 82 days. Roosevelt had met with him exactly twice in that entire time. Truman hadn't been briefed on the atomic bomb. He didn't know about most major foreign policy decisions. He barely knew the cabinet members he was now supposed to lead. And they barely knew him. Most of them had spent 12 years taking orders from Roosevelt. They'd built careers on understanding what Roosevelt wanted. They'd shaped their thinking around Roosevelt's vision. Now they were being asked to serve a man they didn't know, a man who hadn't been part of Roosevelt's inner circle, a man many of them had never expected to be president. The tension started almost immediately, though nobody in Washington saw it coming. The first cabinet meeting after Roosevelt's death took place on April 13th. Truman sat at the head of the table where Roosevelt had sat for 12 years. The cabinet members looked at him with a mixture of grief, uncertainty, and barely concealed doubt. These were men who'd shaped the New Deal, who'd managed a global war, who'd met with Churchill and Stalin, and now they were being asked to follow Harry Truman, a former haberdasher from Missouri who'd spent most of his vice presidency attending funerals and dedication ceremonies. Henry Morgenthau Jr. sat at that table knowing more about Treasury operations than Truman would learn in a decade. Morgenthau had been Roosevelt's friend since 1928, when Roosevelt was governor of New York. They'd been neighbors in Dutchess County, their farms just miles apart. Their families had spent holidays together. Morgenthau's children had played with the Roosevelt grandchildren. When Roosevelt was paralyzed by polio, Morgenthau had helped him manage his property. When Roosevelt became president in 1933, he'd brought Morgenthau to Washington, first as head of the Farm Credit Administration, then as Treasury Secretary starting in January 1934. For 11 years, Morgenthau had been Roosevelt's closest financial advisor. He'd financed the New Deal programs that put millions back to work during the Depression. He'd figured out how to pay for Social Security, the Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps. When war came, he'd raised massive sums for the war effort through war bonds and taxation. War bonds alone brought in $185 billion from 85 million Americans across 8 bond drives. He'd convinced ordinary Americans to buy bonds by marketing them as patriotic duty. He'd negotiated with banks, insurance companies, and major corporations to absorb government debt. He'd managed all of this while keeping inflation under control and maintaining confidence in the dollar. And he'd done something else, something that mattered to him more than any financial achievement. In January 1944, after his staff discovered that the State Department had been suppressing information about the Holocaust, Morgenthau had gone directly to Roosevelt. He'd presented evidence that State Department officials were deliberately blocking rescue efforts for European Jews. He'd demanded action. Roosevelt, facing pressure from Morgenthau and from Congress, had created the War Refugee Board. That board, operating for just 18 months, had saved approximately 200,000 Jews through various rescue operations, including funding Raoul Wallenberg's mission to Budapest. For Morgenthau, who was Jewish and whose grandfather had immigrated from Germany, this was personal. This was about using government power to save lives when bureaucrats wanted to look away. Now Morgenthau sat across from Truman, a man he barely knew, and tried to explain his vision for post-war Germany. That vision was clear and specific. Germany needed to be deindustrialized, broken into agricultural states, stripped completely of its ability to wage war ever again. It was called the Morgenthau Plan. The reasoning was straightforward. Germany had started 2 world wars in 30 years. 50 million people had died. The only way to prevent a third world war was to eliminate Germany's industrial capacity permanently. Take away the steel mills that made tanks, close the chemical plants that made explosives, shut down the factories that made aircraft and submarines, turn Germany into a nation of farmers who couldn't threaten anyone. Roosevelt had initially supported this approach at the Quebec Conference in September 1944. He and Churchill had even initialed a memorandum endorsing the core principles. But then the State Department and War Department had pushed back. They'd argued the plan was too harsh, that it would create chaos in Europe, that it would push Germans toward communism. Roosevelt had backed away from it gradually, though he'd never explicitly rejected it. When Roosevelt died, Morgenthau believed the plan was still viable. He believed Truman would see the logic of it. But Truman opposed it completely. Truman believed a strong Germany was necessary for European stability. He believed the Morgenthau Plan would create economic chaos and push Europe toward the Soviet sphere. When Morgenthau argued for his plan in cabinet meetings, Truman listened politely and ignored him. In May 1945, Truman signed Occupation Directive JCS 1067, which implemented aspects of the Morgenthau Plan, but only temporarily. Morgenthau knew it wouldn't last. The breaking point came in June. Truman was preparing for the Potsdam Conference. Morgenthau insisted on accompanying him. The Treasury Secretary had attended Bretton Woods. He'd been at Quebec with Roosevelt and Churchill. He knew the European leaders. He believed his presence was essential. Truman refused. Morgenthau threatened to resign if he wasn't allowed to go. Truman accepted his resignation immediately. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Morgenthau was stunned. He'd served as Treasury Secretary for 11 years and 5 months. He'd been one of the most powerful men in Washington. Now he was being dismissed like a clerk who'd shown up late for work. On July 6, 1945, the White House announced Morgenthau's resignation. The official statement praised his service. The private reality was different. Morgenthau had been one of Roosevelt's closest advisors, but Truman didn't want him around, at all. Harold Leclerc Hicks had been Secretary of the Interior since March 1933, 13 years, longer than anyone except Secretary of Agriculture Claude Wickard, and before the end of 1945, Hicks would outlast him too. Born in Pennsylvania in 1874, Hicks had worked his way through the University of Chicago, graduated in 1897, then put himself through law school. He'd been a progressive Republican for decades, working for Theodore Roosevelt's Bull Moose campaign in 1912. He'd supported progressive causes, fought corruption in Chicago politics, and built a reputation as an idealist who couldn't be bought. When Franklin Roosevelt asked him to join the cabinet in 1933, Hicks was 58 years old and had never held federal office. Roosevelt gave him 2 jobs: Secretary of Interior and Administrator of the Public Works Administration. The PWA was one of the most important New Deal programs, with $6 billion to spend on infrastructure, dams, bridges, schools, hospitals, and housing projects across America. For 6 years, Hicks managed that money without a single major corruption scandal. Not one. In an era when political machines routinely skimmed from government contracts, when kickbacks were expected, when Chicago politics especially was synonymous with graft, Harold Hicks ran a clean operation. The New York Times praised him for knowing all the rackets that infest the construction industry, and being a terror to collective bidders and skimping contractors. But Hicks was more than just honest. He was a champion of civil rights in an administration that often compromised on race. He desegregated the Department of Interior, making it one of the first federal departments where black and white employees worked together. He championed William Hastie, whom he'd recruited to Interior in 1933, and Roosevelt appointed Hastie as the first African-American federal judge in 1937. He worked directly with Walter Francis White of the NAACP to establish quotas ensuring African Americans got a fair share of PWA construction jobs. When the Daughters of the American Revolution refused to let Marian Anderson, the renowned black contralto, perform at Constitution Hall because of her race, Ickes arranged for her to sing at the Lincoln Memorial instead. On Easter Sunday, April 9, 1939, 75,000 people gathered at the memorial to hear Anderson perform. Ickes introduced her. It became one of the iconic moments of the civil rights movement. Ickes was also known for having a terrible temper and a sharp tongue. He'd clashed repeatedly with Henry Wallace when Wallace was Secretary of Agriculture, fighting over control of forestry policy and grazing rights on federal land. He'd fought with Harry Hopkins, who ran the Works Progress Administration, competing for influence with Roosevelt. He'd even fought with Roosevelt himself, offering to resign multiple times over policy disagreements or perceived slights. Roosevelt had never accepted those resignations. Roosevelt valued Ickes too much. Roosevelt needed someone who would fight for Interior's interests, who would push back against other departments, who couldn't be intimidated or corrupted. Ickes was perfect for that role. But Truman didn't need someone like that. Truman needed team players who would follow his lead without constant argument. Ickes was also known for having a terrible temper. He'd clashed with Henry Wallace when Wallace was Secretary of Agriculture. He'd fought with Harry Hopkins, who ran the Works Progress Administration. He'd even fought with Roosevelt, offering to resign multiple times. Roosevelt had never accepted those resignations. Roosevelt needed Ickes. Roosevelt valued his integrity and his fierce loyalty. Truman didn't. The conflict came in February 1946. Truman nominated Edwin W. Pauley to be Undersecretary of the Navy. Pauley was a wealthy California oil executive. He'd been treasurer of the Democratic National Committee. He was Truman's friend. During Senate confirmation hearings, Pauley testified that he'd never lobbied against the government's lawsuit to establish federal title to oil-rich tidelands along U.S. coasts. Ickes had been fighting for federal control of those tidelands for years, and Ickes knew Pauley was lying. In 1945, Pauley had told Ickes directly that he could raise $300,000 in campaign funds if Ickes would drop the tidelands fight. Ickes testified to this, under oath, in front of the Senate. He stated clearly that Pauley had attempted to trade campaign money for policy favors. The testimony created a firestorm. Truman was furious. He summoned Ickes to the White House and suggested that perhaps Ickes's memory was faulty. Perhaps Ickes had misunderstood what Pauley had said. Perhaps Ickes should reconsider his testimony. Ickes refused. He wrote a 2,000-word letter of resignation. It read in part, "I don't care to stay in an administration where I am expected to commit perjury for the sake of the party. I do not have a reputation for dealing recklessly with the truth." Truman accepted the resignation. He gave Ickes 3 days to vacate his office. 3 days. After 13 years of service, Ickes held a press conference on February 13, 1946. He didn't hold back. He told reporters exactly what had happened. He said Truman had asked him to lie. He said Pauley was unfit for office. He said the administration cared more about political loyalty than integrity. The press loved it. It was front-page news across the country. Truman's approval rating dropped, but Ickes was gone. Henry Agard Wallace was perhaps the most complex figure in Roosevelt's cabinet, and the one whose departure would have the most lasting political consequences. Born in Iowa in 1888, Wallace came from a family of agricultural innovators. His grandfather had founded a farming journal. His father had served as Secretary of Agriculture under Presidents Harding and Coolidge. Henry Wallace himself had become a renowned agricultural scientist, developing high-yield hybrid corn varieties that revolutionized American farming. He turned his father's journal, Wallace's Farmer, into one of the most influential agricultural publications in the Midwest. When Roosevelt made him Secretary of Agriculture in 1933, Wallace was 44 years old, with a reputation as both a scientific genius and a political progressive. He'd broken from the Republican Party over their agricultural policies during the Depression. He'd watched Iowa farmers lose their land while grain prices collapsed. He'd seen sheriffs conduct foreclosure auctions while neighbors stood by helplessly. Wallace believed the government needed to intervene to stabilize agricultural markets, guarantee minimum prices, and preserve family farms. His Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933 transformed American farming policy, establishing price supports and production controls that would shape agriculture for decades. But Wallace was more than an agricultural expert. He became one of the most vocal advocates for liberal causes in Roosevelt's administration. He championed civil rights, speaking at black churches and NAACP gatherings when most white politicians avoided such events. He advocated for labor unions when business leaders wanted them crushed. He pushed for stronger social welfare programs when conservatives called the New Deal socialist. And he developed a vision for America's role in the world that emphasized cooperation over confrontation, economic development over military power, and shared prosperity over imperial competition. In 1940, Roosevelt chose Wallace as his running mate for a third term. It was a controversial choice. Conservative Democrats hated Wallace. Southern Democrats especially opposed his civil rights advocacy. Business leaders feared his economic views. But Roosevelt insisted. He threatened to decline the nomination if the party wouldn't accept Wallace. The party gave in. Wallace became vice president in January 1941. For 4 years, he served as one of the most active vice presidents in history. Roosevelt sent him on diplomatic missions to Latin America, where he learned Spanish and connected with progressive movements. He gave speeches about the century of the common man, articulating a vision where post-war prosperity would be shared globally, not hoarded by imperial powers. He chaired the Board of Economic Warfare, coordinating America's economic strategy during the war. He became the face of Roosevelt's liberal coalition. Then came 1944. Roosevelt was running for an unprecedented fourth term. His health was failing, though few knew how badly. The vice presidency suddenly mattered more than ever before. Conservative Democrats and party bosses saw an opportunity to remove Wallace. They complained that he was too liberal, too idealistic, too sympathetic to labor unions and civil rights activists. More seriously, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had warned Roosevelt that Wallace associated with people who had communist connections. In July 1944, at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, Party Chairman Robert Hannigan orchestrated Wallace's removal from the ticket. Roosevelt, either unwilling or unable to fight for Wallace again, acquiesced. He wrote a letter saying Wallace was his personal choice, but would leave the decision to the delegates. The delegates, managed by party bosses, chose Harry Truman instead. Wallace was devastated. He'd given 4 years of loyal service. He'd campaigned tirelessly for Roosevelt. He'd defended the administration's policies when critics attacked. And now he was being pushed aside for political convenience. Roosevelt softened the blow by offering Wallace a cabinet position. Wallace could choose State Department or Commerce Department. Wallace chose Commerce, believing it would give him a platform to shape post-war economic policy. He took office as Commerce Secretary in March 1945, just weeks before Roosevelt died. Wallace stayed in that position when Truman became president. For a while, it worked. Wallace focused on post-war economic policy. He advocated for a middle course between Soviet-style planned economy and pre-Depression laissez-faire capitalism. He helped pass the Employment Act of 1946. But Wallace had strong views about foreign policy, and those views conflicted directly with Truman's. Wallace believed the United States needed to find peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union. He thought Truman's "get tough" approach towards Stalin would lead to another world war. He wrote letters to Truman throughout 1946 warning about the dangers of confrontation. Truman listened politely and ignored him. In July, Wallace sent Truman a letter about US-Soviet relations. He argued that aggressive military posturing was increasing tensions unnecessarily. Truman acknowledged receiving the letter. He didn't respond to the arguments. On September 12, 1946, Wallace gave a speech at Madison Square Garden in New York. 20,000 people attended. Wallace had submitted the speech to Truman beforehand. Truman had glanced at it briefly and said something vague about approving Wallace's right to speak. Wallace took that as approval of the content. In the speech, Wallace said, "We should recognize that we have no more business in the political affairs of Eastern Europe than Russia has in the political affairs of Latin America, Western Europe, and the United States." He criticized British imperialism. He criticized American military build-up. He said the get tough policy was leading toward war instead of peace. The audience applauded. The press went wild. Secretary of State James Burns was in Paris negotiating with Soviet officials. Burns read about Wallace's speech in the newspapers. He was furious. Foreign ministers from Britain and France asked Burns which policy represented America's actual position, Burns's hard line or Wallace's conciliation. Burns didn't know what to tell them. Reporters asked Truman if Wallace's speech represented administration policy. At first, Truman tried to say he'd approved the speech. Then he had to clarify that he'd only approved Wallace's right to give it, not the content. Then he ordered Wallace to stop discussing foreign policy publicly. Wallace refused. He believed Americans deserved to hear alternative views on Soviet relations. He gave another speech on September 18th. Truman called him to the White House on September 19th. The meeting lasted 2.5 hours. Truman later wrote in his diary, "Wallace spent 2.5 hours talking to me yesterday. I am very much afraid Henry not only is fuzzy, but that he has absorbed some of the commie Jesuit stuff." On September 20th, 1946, Truman asked for Wallace's resignation. Wallace complied. Unlike Ickes, he didn't fight back publicly at first. But the damage was done. The Roosevelt coalition was fracturing. Liberal Democrats felt betrayed. Wallace would later run for president in 1948 as a third-party progressive candidate, splitting the Democratic vote and nearly costing Truman the election. James Burns lasted longer than the others, but his relationship with Truman deteriorated steadily from the beginning. Burns had been a Supreme Court justice. Before that, he'd been a powerful senator from South Carolina. During the war, he'd been director of war mobilization, so powerful that people called him assistant president. When Roosevelt died, Burns had been at Roosevelt's side more recently than Truman had. Burns had attended the Yalta Conference. Truman had barely spoken to Roosevelt in months. Truman appointed Burns Secretary of State in July 1945, replacing Edward Stettinius, who'd only held the job for a few months. Truman chose Burns because Burns knew foreign policy. Truman didn't. Truman was uncertain about his own abilities in international relations. He needed someone who could negotiate with Churchill and Stalin. But the relationship soured almost immediately. Burns traveled constantly. He spent weeks in Europe negotiating at various conferences, Paris, London, Moscow. He made decisions without consulting Truman. He signed agreements without getting presidential approval first. He acted like he was running his own foreign policy independent of the White House. Truman felt disrespected. Burns had wanted to be president. Everyone knew it. Burns had expected to be Roosevelt's running mate in 1944. When the party bosses chose Truman instead, Burns had been bitter. Now Burns was Secretary of State, first in line to the assert presidency since there was no vice president, and he was acting like he should have been president in the first place. In January 1946, Truman sent Burns a long letter. He wrote, "I am not going to have any more secret negotiations carried on without the approval and knowledge of the president. When you went to Moscow, you were there as my representative, and when you returned, you should have reported to me before going on the radio." The letter made Burns furious, but he stayed in the position. He needed to. His reputation was tied to the success of American foreign policy in the post-war period. He couldn't resign without looking like a failure. Throughout 1946, Burns took an increasingly hard line toward the Soviet Union. He gave a famous speech in Stuttgart, Germany in September, repudiating the Morgenthau Plan and calling for German reconstruction. Truman approved of the policy shift. But he didn't approve of Burns making major policy announcements without clearing them with the White House first. Burns submitted his first resignation letter in April 1946. Truman asked him to stay. Burns submitted another resignation letter in December. This time, Truman accepted it. On January 7, 1947, Truman wrote a gracious public letter accepting Burns's resignation effective January 21st. The private reality was less gracious. Truman replaced Burns with General George Marshall, a man Truman trusted completely and who would never try to operate independently of the president. By the end of 1946, only one original Roosevelt cabinet member remained, Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal. Forrestal would stay until September 1947, when Truman reorganized the military and made Forrestal the first Secretary of Defense. But even that relationship would end badly. Forrestal would resign in 1949, suffering from severe depression and paranoia. He would die by suicide 2 months later. The pattern was clear. Truman had systematically replaced everyone who'd been close to Roosevelt. Some left because of policy disagreements like Morgenthau. Some left because they wouldn't compromise their principles like Ickes. Some left because they opposed Truman's foreign policy like Wallace. Some left because they tried to operate independently like Burns. But all of them left. And most of them left bitter, feeling pushed out by a man they didn't think deserved to be president. The replacements were different. Fred Vinson replaced Morgenthau at Treasury. Vinson was a Truman friend from Congress. Julius Krug replaced Ickes at Interior. Krug was competent but had no national profile. Averell Harriman replaced Wallace at Commerce. Harriman was wealthy, connected, and loyal to Truman. George Marshall replaced Burns at State. Marshall was the most respected military leader in America and completely committed to executing Truman's vision. These men didn't question Truman. They didn't try to preserve Roosevelt's legacy. They implemented Truman's agenda. The political consequences were significant and immediate. Liberal Democrats, who had formed the energetic core of Roosevelt's coalition, felt abandoned and betrayed. They'd spent 12 years building the New Deal, fighting for workers' rights, advocating for civil rights, and supporting international cooperation. They'd believed Roosevelt's vision would continue after his death. Now they watched as that vision was systematically dismantled by a president they hadn't chosen and didn't trust. The Americans for Democratic Action, a liberal organization formed in 1947, emerged partly in response to frustration with Truman's rightward shift. Labor unions, which had been Roosevelt's strongest supporters, began questioning their alliance with the Democratic Party. African American leaders, who'd seen real progress under Roosevelt's administration, particularly through appointees like Ickes and the advocacy of Eleanor Roosevelt, worried that progress would stall under Truman. Jewish organizations, which had worked with Morgenthau on refugee issues, lost their most powerful ally in the cabinet. The 1946 midterm elections reflected this fractured coalition. Democrats lost 54 seats in the House and 12 in the Senate. Republicans won control of both chambers for the first time since Herbert Hoover's presidency. The 80th Congress, as it became known, was dominated by conservative Republicans who'd opposed the New Deal from the beginning. They saw Truman's weakness as an opportunity to roll back Roosevelt's programs. The new Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act over Truman's veto in June 1947. The act restricted union activities, banned closed shops, required union leaders to sign affidavits swearing they weren't communists, and gave the president power to impose cooling-off periods during strikes. Labor leaders called it a slave labor act. It reversed much of the progress unions had made under the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. The 80th Congress also passed tax cuts that primarily benefited wealthy Americans, exactly the kind of policy Roosevelt had fought against. Truman vetoed the first version in June 1947, but Congress overrode his veto in 1948 with the Revenue Act. The new tax code reduced rates for high earners and corporations, while providing minimal relief for working families. It was precisely the opposite of Roosevelt's economic philosophy, which had used progressive taxation to fund social programs and reduce inequality. Most symbolically, the 80th Congress proposed the 22nd Amendment, limiting presidents to 2 terms. The amendment was explicitly designed as a posthumous rebuke to Roosevelt, who'd broken the 2-term tradition by winning 4 consecutive elections. The proposal passed Congress in March 1947 and was sent to the states for ratification. It would be ratified in 1951, ensuring no future president could serve as long as Roosevelt had. The Republican sponsors made no secret of their motivation. They wanted to prevent another Roosevelt-style presidency, where one man dominated American politics for more than a decade. The amendment was their revenge against the New Deal coalition. But Truman didn't care about the political cost or the criticism from liberals and conservatives alike. He'd made a fundamental calculation about presidential power and how to exercise it. He couldn't be president while trying to be Roosevelt's caretaker. He couldn't lead while Roosevelt's team second-guessed every decision based on what Roosevelt would have done or what Roosevelt would have wanted. He needed people who worked for him, who understood his priorities, who would implement his vision without constantly comparing it to his predecessors. Every meeting, every policy discussion, every crisis had become an implicit referendum on Roosevelt's legacy. The Roosevelt cabinet members would argue for positions by explaining what Roosevelt had believed or what Roosevelt had intended. Truman wasn't interested in what Roosevelt had intended. Roosevelt was dead. Truman was president. And Truman had his own views about Germany, about the Soviet Union, about domestic policy, about everything. Those views were sometimes similar to Roosevelt's, sometimes different, but they were his views. He needed a team that would execute them, not debate them based on historical comparison. What nobody expected, what shocked political observers across the country, was that Truman's approach would actually work. In 1948, virtually everyone predicted Truman would lose the presidential election. The polling was unanimous. Newsweek surveyed 50 political reporters. All 50 predicted Thomas Dewey would win. The Chicago Tribune was so confident that they printed their morning edition before all the votes were counted, running the famous headline, "Dewey defeats Truman," in massive font across the front page. Life magazine had already published an issue with a photo of Dewey and the caption, "The next President of the United States." Political pundits were already analyzing what Dewey's victory would mean for the Republican Party and how long Democrats would need to rebuild after losing the White House. The conventional wisdom had solid reasoning. Truman's approval rating had dropped to 36% by September. The Democratic Party was fracturing into 3 pieces. Henry Wallace was running as the Progressive Party candidate, appealing to liberals who thought Truman had betrayed Roosevelt's legacy. Wallace's platform called for peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union, desegregation of schools, national health insurance, and an end to the Cold War military buildup. He was expected to peace be aid us, ADTAD, pull millions of votes from Truman in northern industrial states. Simultaneously, Strom Thurmond was running as the states' rights Democratic candidate, the Dixiecrats, appealing to Southern whites who opposed Truman's civil rights initiatives. Thurmond was expected to win the entire Deep South, traditionally Democratic territory. With the party split 3 ways, Thomas Dewey, the moderate Republican governor of New York, would coast to victory with a unified party behind him. Truman won anyway. He won by campaigning as himself, not as Roosevelt's successor. He won by attacking the do-nothing Republican Congress for blocking programs that would help working Americans. He traveled 31,700 miles by train, giving 272 speeches in 29 states, speaking directly to crowds at every stop. He didn't try to be eloquent like Roosevelt. He didn't try to match Roosevelt's radio presence or rhetorical skill. He was blunt, direct, and authentic. He told farmers that Republicans wanted to cut agricultural subsidies. He told workers that Republicans had passed Taft-Hartley to weaken unions. He told veterans that Republicans had opposed GI Bill expansions. He made the election a choice about the future, not a referendum on Roosevelt's past. On election night, November 2nd, 1948, Truman beat Dewey by more than 2 million popular votes, 24 million to 21,970,000. He won 303 electoral votes to Dewey's 189. Wallace carried no states and received only 2.4% of the popular vote, far less than predicted. Thurmond won 4 states in the Deep South, but couldn't stop Truman from winning border states and building a coalition without depending on the solid South. It was one of the greatest political upsets in American history. Truman had won by being Truman, by building his own coalition, by executing his own strategy. The foreign policy Truman built, the policy Wallace opposed and Burns helped create, became America's strategy for the Cold War. The Truman Doctrine committed America to containing Soviet expansion. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Western Europe. NATO created a permanent military alliance against Soviet aggression. These policies defined American foreign policy for the next 40 years. Historians debate whether Truman's hard line towards Stalin was necessary or whether Wallace's approach could have prevented the Cold War. What's not debatable is that Truman believed he needed to clear out Roosevelt's team to implement his vision. Henry Morgenthau spent his remaining years working with Jewish charities. He became a major supporter of Israel, serving as financial advisor to the new nation from 1951 to 1954. He never returned to government. He died in 1967 at age 75. His plan for Germany was largely forgotten, though some historians argue it influenced early occupation policy before being abandoned. Harold Ickes retired to his farm, but stayed active in politics. He wrote a syndicated newspaper column criticizing Truman's policies. He died in February 1952 at age 77. His 13 years as Interior Secretary remained the longest tenure in that office until the 21st century. His secret diary, 3 volumes of detailed observations about Roosevelt's administration, was published posthumously in 1953 and became an essential historical source. Henry Wallace's political career ended badly. His Progressive Party campaign in 1948 was widely viewed as naive and influenced by communist sympathizers. He won just 2.4% of the popular vote. When the Korean War began in 1950, Wallace reversed his position and supported Truman's decision to intervene militarily. The Progressive Party repudiated him. He retired from politics and spent his remaining years writing about agriculture and genetics. He died in 1965 at age 77. Eleanor Roosevelt, who'd initially supported Wallace as Roosevelt's successor, later said she'd been wrong about his judgment in foreign affairs. James Burns returned to South Carolina and practiced law. He was elected governor of South Carolina in 1951. As governor, he opposed the Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education decision and fought against school desegregation. The man who'd helped shape America's early Cold War policy spent his final years in public office defending segregation. He died in 1972 at age 92. His reputation remained mixed, praised for his work on post-war Europe, criticized for his civil rights record. Truman himself never expressed regret about clearing out Roosevelt's cabinet. He believed it was necessary. He believed he couldn't be an effective president while surrounded by people loyal to someone else's vision. In his memoirs, he wrote that every president needs advisors who serve the current administration, not the previous one. Whether that justified the way he handled the removals, the abrupt dismissals, the personal conflicts, remains debated. What's clear is that within 18 months of becoming president, Truman had removed nearly everyone who'd been close to Roosevelt. He'd rebuilt the government around people loyal to him. And he'd done it deliberately, systematically, and without much concern for the personal cost to the men involved. The larger pattern reveals something fundamental about presidential transitions in America. When a vice president inherits the presidency unexpectedly, they inherit a team they didn't choose. That team has loyalties and visions shaped by someone else. The new president faces a choice. They can try to work with that team, respecting their experience and institutional knowledge. or they can clear them out and start fresh with their own people. Truman chose the second option, completely. He didn't do it all at once. He didn't fire everyone on day one. But he created conditions that made it impossible for Roosevelt's team to stay. He disagreed with their policies. He questioned their judgment. He challenged their authority. He made it clear they were working for him, not for the memory of Roosevelt. And when they couldn't accept that, when they tried to preserve Roosevelt's vision or operate independently, he pushed them out. The method varied. Morgenthau was dismissed bluntly when he overreached. Ickes was pushed out when he refused to compromise his integrity. Wallace was fired when he publicly opposed policy. Bernays was eased out when he acted too independently. But the result was the same. They all left. The historical judgment has been kinder to Truman than contemporary observers were. Most historians credit him with successfully navigating the transition from World War II to the Cold War. His hardline stance toward the Soviet Union is generally viewed as necessary given Stalin's actions in Eastern Europe. The Marshall Plan is considered one of the most successful foreign policy initiatives in American history. NATO helped prevent World War III. By those measures, Truman's decision to clear out Roosevelt's team and implement his own vision was correct. But there's another way to look at it. 3 of the men Truman pushed out, Morgenthau, Ickes, and Wallace, had genuine principles they weren't willing to compromise. Morgenthau wanted to prevent Germany from waging war again. That desire came from watching millions die in 2 world wars. Ickes refused to commit perjury, even when the president asked him to. That integrity had defined his 13 years in office. Wallace believed peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union was possible, and that military confrontation made war more likely, not less. History suggests Wallace was wrong about Stalin's intentions, but his warning about an arms race and perpetual military tension proved accurate. These weren't just Roosevelt loyalists resisting change. They were experienced public servants with legitimate policy disagreements and strong moral convictions. Truman could have handled them differently. He could have been more patient with Morgenthau's attachment to his Germany plan. He could have found a way to keep Ickes that didn't require defending poorly. He could have let Wallace voice alternative views on Soviet policy without forcing him out of the cabinet. Instead, Truman chose confrontation. He drew lines and forced people to choose sides. Anyone who wouldn't align completely with his approach had to go. That choice established a pattern that would influence presidential transitions for generations to come. When George H.W. Bush became president after serving as Ronald Reagan's vice president for 8 years, he kept most of Reagan's cabinet initially. Maintaining continuity seemed important after an election victory. But within 18 months, he'd replaced them steadily with his own people, bringing in James Baker from Treasury to State, Dick Cheney to Defense, and filling other positions with advisors who'd worked for him specifically, not for Reagan. When Lyndon Johnson became president after Kennedy's assassination in November 1963, he kept Kennedy's cabinet much longer than Truman had kept Roosevelt's team. Robert McNamara stayed at Defense, Dean Rusk at State, Robert Kennedy at Justice. But eventually, Johnson replaced them too. By his second term, the Kennedy team was gone, replaced by advisors loyal to Johnson's agenda, not Kennedy's memory. The lesson presidents learned from Truman's experience is that inherited teams fundamentally don't work long-term. A president needs advisors who serve their vision, not their predecessors. The question is one of timing. Should a new president move immediately, replacing the inherited team within months, or should they move gradually, keeping experienced people while slowly building their own team? Truman tried the gradual approach at first, asking everyone to stay. But tensions emerged so quickly that within 3 months Morgenthau was gone. Within 10 months Ickes followed. Within 17 months Wallace was fired. Within 21 months Burns resigned. The gradual approach became rapid anyway, because the conflicts were inevitable and irresolvable. Future presidents studied Truman's mistakes and successes. The main lesson was to move faster, not slower. Don't let conflicts fester for months while trying to work with people who don't share your vision. Make the changes quickly, within the first 90 days if possible, before relationships deteriorate and resignations become public spectacles. Gerald Ford, becoming president after Nixon's resignation in August 1974, moved quickly to replace Nixon's team. He cleaned house within weeks, not months, installing his own people before the old guard could become entrenched. George H.W. Bush, despite the Reagan connection, moved faster in his second year than Truman had, recognizing that loyalty to Reagan's memory would eventually conflict with loyalty to his own presidency. The question that remains, the question historians still debate, is whether clearing out experienced advisors is always the wisest course. Morgenthau had financed World War II better than anyone imagined possible, managing the largest expansion of government spending in American history while keeping inflation relatively controlled and maintaining global confidence in the dollar. Those were skills that took a lifetime to develop. His replacement, Fred Vinson, was competent but lacked Morgenthau's experience and relationships with international finance. Similarly, Harold Ickes had run massive public works programs for 13 years without corruption in an era when corruption was endemic in government contracting. That integrity and administrative skill couldn't be replicated simply by appointing someone new. Wallace had revolutionized American agriculture and built relationships with progressive movements across Latin America that took decades to develop. These men represented institutional knowledge, hard-won expertise, and relationships that couldn't be easily replaced. Replacing them with political loyalists who lacked their deep experience created gaps in government competence. The new team was loyal, absolutely. They would execute Truman's vision without questioning it, certainly. But loyalty isn't expertise. Shared vision isn't the same as proven competence. Several of Truman's early appointments struggled in their positions, precisely because they didn't have the institutional knowledge their predecessors had built over more than a decade of service. Julius Krug at Interior never matched Ickes' effectiveness. The Commerce Department under Averell Harriman focused more on business interests than Wallace's broader economic vision. Even at Treasury, where Vinson was capable, there was a learning curve that cost months during a critical period of post-war economic transition. Truman's calculation was that loyalty and shared vision mattered more than experience and institutional knowledge. For his specific purposes, that bet paid off. He successfully implemented his foreign policy vision of containment and confrontation with the Soviet Union. He won election in his own right, in 1948, legitimizing his presidency. He established himself as a president separate from Roosevelt's shadow, with his own policies and his own legacy. The Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, NATO, these became defining achievements of his presidency, policies that couldn't have happened if he'd been trying to preserve Roosevelt's approach to the Soviet Union. In that sense, clearing out the Roosevelt team was necessary for Truman to govern effectively according to his own judgment, but the cost was substantial and lasting. He lost access to some of the most capable administrators in American government, people whose expertise had been proven over years of crisis management. He created lasting bitterness among liberal Democrats who felt the New Deal coalition was being betrayed for Cold War politics and anti-communist paranoia. He damaged relationships with foreign leaders who'd worked closely with Morgenthau on economic issues or with Wallace on Latin American relations. He set a precedent that presidential transitions should prioritize political loyalty over expertise, experience, and institutional continuity. Every president since has faced this same tension, and most have followed Truman's example of choosing loyalty over experience when the two conflicted. The story of how Truman fired everyone who worked for Roosevelt isn't just about personnel changes. It's about the fundamental tension between loyalty and independence in government. It's about whether strong advisors who disagree with you are assets or liabilities. It's about whether a president should surround themselves with people who'll execute their vision unquestioningly, or with people who'll challenge their assumptions and force them to defend their decisions. Roosevelt had valued strong, independent cabinet members. His team argued constantly. They fought over policy. They leaked to the press. They formed factions. Roosevelt saw that as healthy. He believed the clash of ideas produced better decisions. Truman saw it as chaos. He believed effective leadership required a unified team executing a clear strategy. Both approaches have merit, but they're incompatible. When Truman inherited Roosevelt's cabinet, he inherited a team built for Roosevelt's leadership style. Those men weren't wired to be yes men. They were wired to argue, to advocate, to push back. That's what Roosevelt had wanted. Truman wanted something different. He wanted execution, not deliberation. So the Roosevelt team had to go, all of them, within 18 months. That's how innovation in government actually happens. Not through smooth transitions and careful institutional preservation, but through new leaders willing to clear out the old guard and start fresh, even when it means losing experienced people, even when it means creating political enemies, even when it means being called disloyal to their predecessors' legacy. Truman understood that he couldn't be president while trying to honor Roosevelt's memory. He had to be his own president. And that meant surrounding himself with his own people who worked for Harry Truman, not for the ghost of Franklin Roosevelt. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from American history. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where the CIS bond to you are watching from. Our community spans the globe. From history enthusiasts to political science students, you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.